right, everyone, welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started in the interest of time, but thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday evening. And especially, Helen, thank you for joining us because we know you are 4 hours ahead. So we're deeply appreciative of your time with us this evening. So, why are we here today? First of all, we just felt that this was a very necessary program. And what began as a documentary screening and fireside chat kind of evolved over the last week or so because we started to receive a lot of inquiries about the U.S. history of aggression against Cuba, as well as how this kind of related to our own experience in the Low Country. So we decided to make it a more collaborative event with our coalition partners and friends. So you'll be able to hear from the Charleston Climate Coalition today, the People's Budget Coalition, the Lowcountry Black and Hispanic Coalition, and the Lowcountry Action Committee. So we're going to get into brief introductions, and then I'll hand it off for some history with Salifu and Joshua. So first up is the Lowcountry Action Committee. And we are a Black-led grassroots organization dedicated to Black liberation through service, political education, and collective action in the Low Country of South Carolina. We have several different programs. The most, I guess, the most known around the Low Country is our Freedom Bag Drive, and we serve about 100 families right now. In the next couple of months, we plan to triple or even quadruple our support in the community. We also have a Summer Youth Institute, and we do several different community programs, which include AIR's property workshops, vaccination clinics, collaborative events with the People's Budget Coalition, just several initiatives that are based on our community needs, and these are ever evolving. So that is LAC. Now I'm going to pass it over to the Lowcountry Black and Hispanic Coalition for an introduction. And I believe Faden will be doing this introduction in Spanish with Erica translating into English. Take it away.
Hey guys, my name is Faden Santana. Soy uno de los fundadores de la coalición, Black and Hispanic Coalition de Charleston. Pues una de nuestras misiones es poder buscar un poquito más de igualdad, acceso y exigir pues a los gobiernos locales y municipales cómo tener abrirnos puertas a nuestras comunidades, a nuestras minorías. Una de las cosas que hacemos pues es cada tercer miércoles de cada mes tener algunas reuniones con líderes comunitarios, personas que están envueltas en nuestra comunidad y creen en la igualdad. Actualmente hemos hecho algunos programas de vacunas. Hemos estado trabajando en una campaña que se llama Hola Charleston, que es exigirle a nuestros gobiernos locales y municipales el acceso y pues la transparencia a nuestros grupos de hispanos hablantes que han estado llegando a nuestra comunidad. Así que esa es nuestra coalición y muchas gracias. Ahora Erika le dará la introducción.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Erica Beal, and I am a founding member of the Lowcountry Black and Hispanic Coalition. We are a coalition of Black and Hispanic-led community members, business leaders, and organizational allies. We are dedicated to developing resources, tools, and relationships that address inequality in our communities. And we meet every third Wednesday. We have put on, and we discuss issues that are facing the community. We have put together a needs assessment, and we have planned several programs that we would like to execute in 2022 to connect more with our community members. We put on vaccination clinics. We plan on expanding in partnership with the Lowcountry Action Committee, the Freedom Bag Food Drive, and we're also co-sponsoring this event. And one of our main campaigns this year is Hola Charleston, which is meant to empower Spanish-speaking community members by putting pressure on city and county government to translate all public communications into Spanish in an effort to recognize our third largest demographic here in the Low Country and make sure that the Spanish-speaking community feels supported and empowered and has the tools that they need to thrive and be successful here in the Low Country.
Thank you, Faden and Erica. Next, we will have introductions from the Charleston Climate Coalition. Belvin, take it away.
Hey everyone, I'm Belvin Nolosov, and I'm the co-director of the Charleston Climate Coalition, which is a local climate activism and advocacy group based here in the Lowcountry, basically trying to do the most we can on the climate crisis from where we are. Some of our core tenets and values are that we need to be mending injustice as we move towards climate action. We need to build a mass movement, and we have to be creative and joyful as we do it. These are some of our action areas that folks can get involved with. Art and media, the main thing we're working on right now is a climate magazine. It's called Surge. We're going to be publishing that either quarterly or thrice yearly. That's a great way to get involved if you're creative. We have event planning. We just had a green fashion show to explain the connection between fashion and clothing and the climate crisis. Our Climate Alliance program is getting lots of local businesses, groups, farms, restaurants, et cetera, involved in climate advocacy and activism and helping them revamp their practices. And of course, we're doing the political fight too, trying to push for the county and all of our local municipalities be passing robust equity-centered climate action plans. If you want to get involved, it's supposed to be a grassroots-wide movement, so we'd love to have you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Belvin. And finally, we have Helen, introductions from the People's Budget Coalition.
Yeah, so the People's Budget Coalition is a coalition united front advocating for an equitable city budget and the elimination of poverty, racial disparities, and redistribution of power to create true accountability with city officials. To invest in true public safety, Charleston must reallocate, improve access to housing, provide opportunities for youth, build safe infrastructure, guarantee all city workers a living wage, and directly invest in racial justice. So those are the areas that we focus on in our advocacy.
Awesome. And we'll have a chance to get more information about all of these organizations towards the end of our program. The next section, we are going over a brief history of U.S.-Cuba relations. And like Salif said earlier, we are trying to condense a tremendous amount of history into a short period of time. So we encourage you to look things up yourself, continue to dive deeply into this history and gain more knowledge about why this affects us all. So now I will turn it over to Joshua Parks, who will give us this presentation.
Switcheroo. So, hello everybody, my name is Joshua. I'm also a co-founding member of the Lowcountry Action Committee, as well as part of the National Network on Cuba. And I'm excited to be here with y'all today in this event. So again, just to echo Shaquille's sentiment, this is simply an overview touching on some important events that happened, just to really contextualize what's going to be discussed later on in this event. So by no means is this an exhaustive historical overview. So we're going to be going over Cuba's relationship to the Lowcountry, pre-colonial Cuba, Cuba's history as a slave colony, the War of Independence in Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, and sanctions. So many of you may be thinking, what does Cuba have to do with the Lowcountry? How are these two places related? And it's actually funny because the history is very, very similar. Both the Lowcountry, which is a region really from Georgetown, South Carolina, all the way down to St. Augustine, Florida, and Cuba, both are places that were heavily influenced by colonialism. So about 500 years ago, Cuba, the Spanish began to colonize Cuba. And with that, there was a genocide against the Native Americans, obviously, and there was an influx of enslaved Africans that they imported over here to Cuba to work. A very similar history happened here in the Lowcountry. Again, there were Native Americans, indigenous people living here in the Lowcountry before Europeans came to colonize, and to, again, bring an influx of enslaved Africans to the region in order to do the labor, which consisted of rice plantations, cotton plantations, sugar plantations in Cuba, et cetera. And with that, a large influx of Africans, we have a great deal of African cultural retention that is still here in the Lowcountry, evidenced by the foodways, by the music, by the religion and spiritual practices. And a similar case in Cuba, evidenced by almost every facet of life in Cuba is influenced by Africa. All right, so again, the pre-colonial era, again, we're just gonna briefly touch on some important events. So before Columbus came here in 1492, again, we just wanna name the people that were inhabiting Cuba and the Caribbean islands. We had the Taino and the Guanahabatay people. And it wasn't the narrative that we usually taught in school where, you know, Columbus came, he saw, he conquered. There was resistance in Cuba. And we have, again, we want to name names when we can. So we have Hati, who is one of the more known indigenous leaders of resistance that was in Cuba, resisting Spanish colonialism. So once Cuba was finally, you know, colonized by the Spaniards, it became one of Europe's most lucrative possessions. And Cuba was a large export of sugar as its cash crop. And many of you know that, you know, sugar plantations are dubbed as one of the most harsh work environments that there is. So, you know, plantation life was very brutal in Cuba. There were high mortality rates. They always had to have a steady influx of Africans coming in to meet that labor demand because, again, it was so brutal and so many people died at such a young age working on those plantations. So Cuba essentially practiced chattel slavery from about 1513 all the way up until 1886, when slavery was supposedly abolished, but we know it never really goes like that. They were the second to last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, Brazil being the last in 1888. But although slavery was abolished during that time, for most of the people, most of the masses of people, the descendants of Africans and indigenous folks and poor people, the conditions really didn't change much after slavery was abolished. So we have to talk about the resistance that was going on during the colonial period. So the Cuban War for Independence was really a series of liberation wars. So you have from 1868 to 1889, that general time period is really what we consider the Cuban War for Independence. And you have national heroes that come out of this movement, Antonio Maceo, Jose Marti, and other folks that, you know, became symbols of Cuban resistance. And in about 1889, we have the Treaty of Paris, which was signed and made Cuba a protectorate, basically of a colony, essentially, of the United States. And this legislation essentially was the foundation that would allow the United States to dominate Cuba for the next half a century, essentially. 1901, the Platt Amendment was passed. And this is important because this was the piece of legislation that allowed for, that essentially forced Cuba, while it was under United States domination, to lease land to the United States. And the United States, of course, used that land to build a military base, the most infamous probably on the planet, Guantanamo Bay. It's known to this day for, you know, the crimes against humanity that were committed against many people. And forward, sorry, going back. Okay, in the Cuban Revolution. So essentially everything that I just talked about before, I like to think of that as, you know, events that led up to the Cuban Revolution. And the Cuban Revolution is like all of these events coming to a head. Because although most people, you know, study the Cuban Revolution in isolation, I think it's important to really look at it as a progressive development and finally like all of this struggle coming into fruition. So in 1959, the Cuban Revolution it was won. And from that point on, you know, there was a lot of United States aggression toward Cuba because they weren't satisfied with the results of the revolution. You know, the United States owned many of the sugar plantations. They owned many of the land and the resources and the raw materials that Cuba, that was basically the wealth of Cuba. And so the Fidel Castro and many other leaders of the Cuban Revolution took a hard stance on that. So they basically nationalized all the large plantations and the large industries. They took back Havana, which was overrun by Americans and mobsters, and they really cracked down on that, and really it lost the United States a lot of money, so they were upset about that. And that is what we're going to get into next. And when Salifu is going to take it away, talking about these sanctions.
Thank you, Josh, for making it clear that the Cuban Revolution is an objectively good thing. It is a positive thing that happened in human history. But because it was so positive, the country was hit with swift sanctions from the United States. And those sanctions today have formed together to become something that we call the blockade, well, that Cubans call the blockade. So what you need to know about the blockade is that it's a set of policies that control how Cubans get things that they need to survive. So here's a little background about the blockade, because like I said, the blockade, think about the blockade, it's a box with a bunch of different sanctions in it. So sanctions violate international law, the UN Charter, and the Geneva and Nuremberg Conventions, because they deliberately target civilians through economic strangulation. They create famines, life-threatening shortages, and economic chaos. That is the intent. The reason why it is important to make this clear, y'all, is because in the United States, our media plays games. They talk often about how they target sanctions against leaders and government officials. There's no such thing. When you sanction a country, you sanction the most vulnerable people inside of that country. And so the goal in the specific instance of Cuba was to sanction the country in order to have the people overthrow their government. So go to the next slide. So this is a receipt, because when I say that, and when we say that, sometimes people like to be like, no, it wasn't, you're being dramatic. No, I'm going to read to you here what this original document says, signed April 6, 1960. So here, points 1 through 6, you have this list of grievances that the president has with Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution at the time. In these last 2 paragraphs, I'm going to jump right in. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. I did not make that up. I did not write that. It is right there in the document. All right, let me get the next slide. So the way that the blockade works, let's talk about this in the most simple terms possible. So with the blockade being this set of policies that controls the way that Cubans are able to get things that they need to survive, there's one portion of it that is obviously the travel restrictions. So the Cuban passport is strictly regulated. It is difficult to get out of Cuba, it's difficult to get in. Right. Another portion of those sanctions that comprise the blockade are trade restrictions. So first of all, Cuba is cut out of possible trading with the United States. So some people say, well, that's fine. You don't have to trade with the United States, trade with other people. Duh. But this is the thing. The United States is it is the behemoth of the world. If you are not allowed to trade with the major economic power in the world, you're cut out of lots of other opportunities, right? But then also, it's not just being blocked from trading with the US, but the US has found coercive ways to punish other countries that attempt to trade with Cuba. So an example of that would be, if you are a country and you have 1% of your business in a country outside of the US, and 1% of your business dealings are headquartered in or serviced through the United States, you can get fined for trading and participating in trade with Cuba. Another example is if you send your ships into the ports in Cuba and they dock there, your ships cannot dock at ports in the United States upwards of 6 months after that. Most countries cannot, again, afford to be cut out of trade with the United States for months at a time. That would cripple some developing countries' entire economy and send things like into spiral. And then the last thing I want to mention is banking restrictions. So there are these things called remittances, where at one point in time it was very, and I won't say easy, but it was much easier to send money back to family and friends on the island if you lived in the US or in Europe or somewhere else in the world. But there are these tiny small ways, right, of restricting money flow into Cuba. So there's no such thing as sending a cash app to somebody in Cuba. There's no such thing as Venmo, PayPal. You're not going down to the Western Union to send your auntie money. Like none of these things are possible. And the only ways that they have been historically possible have been tightly regulated. And another thing that I want to point out here is that the blockade is also racist, right? Because Cuba is a developing socialist country, right? So what their project is about creating equality for everyone, but the blockade stands in the way of that. After that Cuban Revolution happened, who do you think the people were that left the island en masse? Who do you think the people were that had access to getting out and leaving because they didn't want to share in that process of communalizing and nationalizing Cuba? There were white Cubans, the ones in Miami who today pressure politicians to create strict laws against Cuba and add to the massively insane and unhinged US propaganda against Cuba. So what that did was in fact create inequality in some places on the island, not as by design by the Cuban government, but as a design of the blockade. Let me get the next slide. All right, so I also want to take this second because another thing that happens often is when we talk about sanctions, it's hard for people to imagine how they operate day to day. But there are some examples of the ways that sanctions operate in Cuba that you can think about domestically as well, right? So one of those examples is welfare reform. So under the Clinton administration in the 90s, that cut off food access for thousands of African families and single parent households. So what happened in the 90s was welfare programs were scrapped and replaced with this thing called aid to families with dependent children, right? And what ended up happening in the aftermath of welfare reform was that there was a sharp rise in the number of, hold on, y'all, I'm sorry. As y'all know, Black people in the Lowcountry are very loud. I need to close my door. Okay, here we go. So what that did was it created a sharp rise in the number of households with children reporting incomes of less than 2 people per day. That's right here in the United States. So what welfare reform did was it created all these BS means testing that you had to go through in order to get government support. It creates these huge hurdles between people who need things and the state. So there's these strict restrictions that disqualify you if you work this many hours, if you don't work this many hours, if this kind of person is in your home, if you're a single mom and then there's a man present in your home, and all these things just to get assistance for the government. And so I want to add to this point that it's not a stretch to consider that if sanctions in other countries are designed to weaken them into submission, then these kinds of sanctions on poor people in the US are meant to drive people toward desperation, then toward crime, and then funnel specifically Black and brown people directly into the prison industrial complex, as well as our children into foster care and child protective services. So just something for people to think about. Let me get the next slide. So again, you have these sanctions that create this blockade around Cuba, and in the 90s, it creates this thing that's known today as a special period. Basically, after the illegal dismantling of the Soviet Union, people like to say that it fell. It did not fall. It was illegally dismantled, and it had a ripple effect around the world. But one of those effects was that Cuba lost a major trading partner. It created a massive shortage of food, medicine, and resources on the island. Cuba, as an innovative and creative and highly energized country, worked tirelessly to pull themselves out of that predicament, and into some periods of prosperity beyond that. But it's important to know that the maintenance of this blockade and the impact, the sort of two-punch of the blockade in the COVID-19 pandemic has created a similar situation on the island today. But let me get the next slide. Despite these challenges, but despite these many challenges created by the U.S. economic blockade, Cuba is making significant investments in housing and healthcare and education and supporting their most vulnerable populations. This stands in stark contrast. Next slide. This stands in stark contrast to the reality that we are facing in a city like Charleston, where any resources to improve the lives of Black and brown people year after year are delivered to the cops. They're delivered to the police. So in a city like Charleston, where 30% of the Charleston County and city of Charleston and North Charleston budgets go directly to law enforcement, in a place like Charleston County, which is a district comprised of two parallel school systems, one that is successful and predominantly wealthy and white, and the other that is rife with failure, mainly poor, with mostly African and Hispanic students. And then lastly, in a place like Charleston and our surrounding sea islands, which are incredibly vulnerable to climate change and rising seas, but with no substantial plan to address it. So let me get this next slide. So the Lowcountry Action Committee, and in this picture you see me and Shaquille, we made our first trip to Cuba in November. It changed our lives, made us real anti-imperialist. But the Lowcountry Action Committee knows that, you know, you can't copy solutions from one place and just paste them onto another place. But what we are looking at Cuba as is a model for how you develop literacy, address homelessness, and proactively seek ways to live in harmony with the rest of the planet. So we're very honored to have Dr. Helen Yaffe here today, who's going to talk more about this later. But first, we are going to watch a clip from a documentary that he co-produced that speaks directly to this issue of climate and how a country has come together to tackle it.
All right, everyone. So to give you a little context before we jump right into the clip, this clip is actually in the middle of the documentary. So the first half of the documentary, we see it shedding light on kind of the structure of organization in Cuba. So it talks about the state's control of production and distribution. It speaks to the challenges faced by a developing nation, as Salifu mentioned earlier. So Helen, actually, Dr. Helen, because we're two Helens on the call, she speaks with scientists, citizens, law students, national defense experts, and environmental specialists to uncover more information about Cuba's model and their commitment to environmental excellence and really excellence as a whole. So they have a 100-year plan to protect not only the environment, but Cuban citizens. And so the latter half includes plans and actions for the adaptation of these new policies, the preservation of beaches, of coastlines and forests, and even highlights Comandante Fidel talking about the unjust economical order of the world and the existing distribution of wealth, which is contributing and reinforcing these consumerist habits that are affecting our environment and our livelihood. So with that being said, give me 1 second and we will play the clip. And then after that, we'll immediately get into the fireside chat between Dr. Yaffe and Salifu. And what the person that you'll see first is Orlando Rey Santos, who's an advisor to the minister for the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment in Cuba.
En nuestro análisis en el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente, el tema de los asentamientos humanos amenazados es considerado el más complejo de todos. Porque con independencia de la inevitabilidad de algunas medidas, siempre es traumático. No se trata de incomprensión de las personas, puede haber casos de incomprensión, sino que en cualquier situación es muy doloroso porque implica todo un cambio de formas de vida, implica un cambio cultural, implica un cambio de tradición.
Puedo hacerles una pregunta. Nos dijeron que esa área de Santa Fe está muy baja y entre el mar, y que esas casas que vemos aquí han sido abandonadas.
Como debido al cambio climático, las mareas que se forman de aquí del noroeste se han llevado todos los muros de la orilla de la playa, se han llevado. Y como no hay para reparar, se va desbaratando más y se va desbaratando más y se va desbaratando más.
¿Y usted vive aquí?
Yo vivo ahí. Yo nací ahí. A mi casa, cuando el mar entra, quitamos las puertas del frente, la puerta del fondo y la puerta del frente. Subimos todas las cosas para arriba y el agua entra por la puerta de atrás y sale por adelante como si estuvieran en el mar. Como si estuvieran en un barco en el mar, ¿no? El agua sale, ha llegado a la escuela, a la secundaria que está casi a 5 cuadras aquí.
Cuba, yo creo que siempre tiene consultas. No quiere decir que el 100% de la población esté de acuerdo con esa toma de decisiones, por supuesto. No es obligado, no es una represión para el que no lo haga. Lo que realmente hay que evaluar esta posibilidad de que el Estado cubano te está dando, de que vayas a vivir a otro lugar cercano también, porque las personas que viven del mar y que han nacido en el mar jamás van a querer darle la espalda al mar.
El problema es que el 99% de la gente que vive a la orilla del mar aquí no se quiere ir de aquí. Nosotros mismos, mi casa antiguamente era de madera, de 2 pisos.
Ajá.
El mar, la primera vez que el mar entró, dejó la casa, la parte de arriba y la parte de abajo la dejó en la pared del frente y en la pared de atrás. Y nos dijeron que estaba inhabitable, pero nosotros la levantamos, después tumbamos la parte de arriba y empezamos a construir. Pero no hemos quedado parados porque los materiales están muy caros. Está muy caro.
Y no quieren moverte.
No, nosotros aquí no nos vamos. Esa casa se puede dar en un bloque, que yo aquí lo moví. En un bloque. Yo me meto a los botes a mí.
¿Y ustedes son pescadores?
Pescadores, todos son pescadores. Que lo viven más que el que vive a la orilla más paga lo que hace es pescar. El que vive en el campo vive en la tierra, el que vive a la orilla más lo que vive a la pesca.
Llegará el momento en que realmente esas casas no van a poder estar ellos viviendo en ellas porque quedarán inundadas.
A mí simplemente no me gustaría salir de aquí porque ya es un amor que le tengo a esto. Pero bueno, Dios gracias que no nunca tenga que mudarme. Me gusta esto aquí, simplemente el barrio, los amigos y todo lo mismo. Y ya uno está acostumbrado a esto.
Sí, pero en tu grado 2, mira cuántas casas abandonadas aquí, que es muy probable que ustedes van a tener que también abandonar, ¿no?
Sí, ya de un tiempo, quizás de aquí a un tiempo puede ser que también tengamos que irnos o evacuar, no sé, cualquier cosa debido a cualquier cambio climático.
Toda la parte de Santa Fe, el náutico, todo eso tiene una prioridad en todo el trabajo de adaptación al cambio climático y sobre todo de estas zonas pesqueras y de estas áreas donde habitan personas de toda la vida que viven allí y que hacían uso de la costa fundamentalmente. Lo que pasa es que hoy tienen una afectación y dentro de 50 años tendrán otra afectación mayor.
Todo ese proceso de reubicación de personas que residen en asentamientos que están bajo alto riesgo por su vulnerabilidad es financiado por el Estado. De hecho, es una de las complejidades para dinamizar más ese proceso, porque como no es dejado a las posibilidades de cada ciudadano, sino que el Estado asume esa responsabilidad, requiere recursos cuantiosos que el Estado tiene que prorratear entre muchos gastos que tiene. Pero es una de las áreas priorizadas de actividad del Estado, generar esa reubicación. Se han construido nuevos asentamientos, se han construido nuevas comunidades, se han construido nuevas edificaciones en comunidades preexistentes. Una de las cosas que también nosotros hemos aprendido es que no es solamente un tema físico de reubicar viviendas, se tiene que reubicar toda una forma de vida, se tiene que reconstruir un escenario donde esas personas tienen los servicios sociales, los servicios médicos, los servicios educativos y tienen las oportunidades de trabajo. Eso se hace más complejo cuando el trabajo original en la comunidad está muy ligado a la costa, como pasa en el caso de las comunidades pesqueras. Hemos ido evolucionando hacia la idea de que la reubicación de comunidades es una medida extrema que solo se aplica cuando se han agotado todas las otras medidas. Porque al final, viviendo en una isla estrecha y alargada, usted no puede resolver los problemas en la zona costera a través de la reubicación de la población. Entonces eso hay que resolverlo con medidas sobre la costa. Y ahí es donde estamos privilegiando las soluciones naturales donde quiera que es posible. No se trata de una cuestión mecánica.
Tenemos que entender que tenemos que construir de acuerdo al área de intervención con los materiales y con las formas arquitectónicas mejores de resistencia y de menor costo económica también para la familia.
En el caso de Cuba se estudia el cambio climático ya científicamente organizado desde la década del 90. Desde entonces se viene haciendo este trabajo en Cuba. En el año 92 se hizo la primera evaluación del impacto del cambio climático.
También podemos decir que los estudios de peligro y vulnerabilidad de riesgo que se iniciaron en el 2007 por indicación del general de ejército, Raúl Castro Ruz, fueron la base también para el plan de enfrentamiento al cambio climático. El estudio del macroproyecto Macroproyectos son los escenarios de cambio climático, elevación del nivel del mar con periodo 2050-2100. Es la antesala también de la tarea vida.
Nosotros, por ejemplo, tenemos estudios para Cuba que indican que el ascenso del nivel medio del mar estaría en el orden de los 29 centímetros al 2050. Pero entonces ese mismo análisis lo tenemos hecho para 66 puntos del territorio nacional, donde hay diferencias que dependen de las circunstancias locales. Un análisis de ese tipo, donde usted lleva los datos del IPCC sobre el ascenso del nivel del mar a nivel global hasta una localidad en Cuba, solo lo puede hacer si tiene una ciencia muy fuerte de respaldo atrás.
Hay algo que Cuba tiene a su favor y es que tiene institutos de investigación, universidades y centros científicos en todo el país. Hay delegaciones del Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente en estos territorios. Están los estudios de peligro, vulnerabilidad y riesgo para el cambio climático en todos estos territorios con equipos de trabajo. Y eso facilita que el proceso sea más expedito, más rápido.
Nosotros hicimos y presentamos al gobierno este año una evaluación del 2017-2020 y en estos días debemos presentar las proyecciones 2021-2025. Pero una de las debilidades del corto plazo es la limitada participación de la ciencia social. Nosotros estamos convencidos de que hace falta mucho más intervención de las ciencias sociales porque informamos mucho a la población, se comparte la información con ellos, pero también hay que tratar de hacerlos unos participantes más activos en la toma de esas decisiones, porque por ahí van a venir muchas ideas que a lo mejor no se han considerado de inicio.
Las ciencias sociales, como es conocido, llegamos un poquito tarde a la dimensión ambiental de este desarrollo, no solo en Cuba, sino a nivel mundial. Y cada vez yo creo que van ganando un papel mayor, que tiene que ver con estos referentes metodológicos del cómo hacer, de cómo trabajar con las personas. El trabajo con las personas lleva metodología, lleva acompañamiento. Entonces hemos estado acompañando desde procesos que tienen que ver con la educación popular ambiental, la investigación, acción participativa, el diseño de planes de consulta. Yo creo que cada vez más las ciencias sociales estamos jugando un papel que es crucial, es un papel definitivo. Hay un tema que para nosotros es de gran importancia y es lo vinculado a la gestión del conocimiento. Ese conocimiento científico tiene que tener un lenguaje accesible a las personas, que las personas lo puedan entender, que las personas lo puedan comprender. Ahí hay un elemento importante. Yo creo que otro elemento importante que las ciencias sociales tienen que jugar es a ese diálogo de saberes entre ese saber científico que se produce y el saber que tienen las personas en los espacios locales y comunitarios.
In our country, in Cuba, from preschool education, we see how the education teach boys and girls to care about the nature. We have a lot of institutions and community organizations that work with kids and with young people in activities like planting trees and collecting waste, collecting plastic, cleaning the beaches, the rivers. And definitely this is something really important to teach the kids because they are the future generation.
Los medios masivos de comunicación dedican un importante espacio también a esta problemática climática. El Instituto Cubano de Radio y Televisión es también parte de este grupo de trabajo para la tarea vida, de manera que institucionalmente eso está bien. Después, cuando usted va al detalle de la implementación, hay todavía muchos aspectos que mejorar. Es importante que eso se comprenda. Son procesos muy complejos. Es el cambio en la mentalidad. Uno de los procesos complejos en la educación es convencer de que no estamos experimentando una situación transitoria que tiene que ver con un huracán o otro evento extremo, sino un cambio completo en las condiciones en que vamos a vivir, que implica que hay que alimentarnos diferente, construir diferente, vestirnos diferente. Entonces eso es muy complejo y por tanto hay que explicar muy claro los impactos incluso del cambio climático en la salud o en la seguridad alimentaria. Hay que vincularlo a los problemas de la vida de las personas para que no parezca que es una cuestión teórica, conceptual, metodológica. Nosotros recibimos en 1 metro cuadrado, solo 1 metro cuadrado, una radiación solar equivalente al consumo promedio en Cuba de toda una casa. A las 12 del día, más o menos, te coge científico grave. Está echando vapor.
¿Qué está bien?
Una cocina.
Una cocina.
Es una cocina sola. Ahí se puede hacer papas, hacer todo lo que tú quieras. Nosotros tenemos un plan. Ya tenemos que estar en la tarea de llegar a un 24% de la electricidad producida, que en este momento estamos produciendo con petróleo y fundamentalmente petróleo importado, de producir con fuentes renovables. ¿Qué implica tarea vida? O sea, una reconversión, digamos, a un transporte más limpio, eléctrico. Entonces eso tiene un costo alto, pero el razonamiento es el siguiente. De todas formas, Cuba tiene que invertir en transporte, de todas formas tiene que invertir en energía. Entonces, a veces no es tanto cuánto más implica eso desde tarea vida o desde la política climática, sino la posibilidad de hacerlo diferente. Si ya tengo que invertir en transporte, voy a la búsqueda del transporte colectivo, de tipo eléctrico, el que sea más eficiente. O sea, mi inversión normal, hacerla lo más eficaz posible, lo más verde posible y lo más limpia posible. No solo la inversión climática propiamente, sino cualquier inversión que yo haga. En todos los países del mundo, en cualquier lugar de Europa, en cualquier lugar de África, en cualquier lugar de Asia, en cualquier lugar de América, en cualquier lugar del mundo, existen suficientes fuentes renovables de energía para lograr el verdadero desarrollo sostenible. Nosotros tenemos la energía solar directa, que la podemos utilizar tanto para calor, o producir calor, o producir electricidad. Pero tenemos el viento, tenemos la biomasa, tenemos los residuales, tenemos el biogás, tenemos tantas cosas que realmente son mucho más que las cosas que necesitamos. Realmente todo podemos hacerlo con fuentes renovables. No tenemos ya por qué seguir contaminando. Ya no hace falta contaminar el medio ambiente. También estamos apostando a los instrumentos económicos, de manera que los propios mecanismos de tarea vida generen recursos que regresan a esas actividades. Por ejemplo, el estímulo para que las personas puedan introducir sistemas de biogás en la finca, o que puedan instalar paneles eléctricos en la casa, y el establecimiento de líneas de crédito del Estado para eso. De manera que usted tendría un capital retornable. No todo el capital sería a fondo perdido, sino que tendría un retorno de capital. En este momento nosotros estamos enviando un poquitico de CO2 a la atmósfera. Acuérdate que la economía nuestra es muy poca, pero estamos contaminando. O sea, podemos decir que también contaminamos. O sea, los carros son petroleros. La electricidad nuestra es eminentemente petrolera. Entonces nosotros tenemos que primero tenemos un programa, ya tenemos un programa donde hay que ir al transporte con fuentes renovables de energía. Podemos. Y tenemos también que ir al uso de las fuentes naturales de energía, que también podemos. ¿Cuál es nuestro gran problema? El problema es el bloqueo. El bloqueo. Por eso es que no podemos caminar más rápido. Ya más de 60 años de bloqueo. En estos momentos muy incrementado, la administración de Trump ha hecho mucho daño. Y todavía Biden no muestra, a pesar de que lo dijo en su campaña electoral, nada por aflojar las medidas. Y tiene el país en una situación muy difícil, porque aunque muchos piensan que no, hay una persecución real.
Si quieren ayudar a nuestro país realmente, como lo dicen, que se elimine definitivamente el bloqueo contra nuestro país. Somos un pueblo listo para combatir junto a Fidel, a Raúl, a Canel y a todos los revolucionarios que vamos a defender nuestras conquistas al precio que sea necesario. Defendemos la casa y que quiten el bloqueo. Y nos merecemos trabajar sin presiones.
Nos merecemos ser libres, libres para nuestro comercio, libres para comprar más medicamentos, para que nuestra vida social tenga armonía, tengamos calidad de vida. Eso se lo merece el pueblo de Cuba. Si realmente quiere ayudar a Cuba, levante el bloqueo, levante las sanciones. No es tan complicado, es solo un pueblo que quiere valerse por sí mismo y lograr desarrollarse. Simplemente eso. No más agresiones, solamente levante el bloqueo.
Wow. All right. So thank you all for your attention. What a beautiful, beautiful excerpt from the documentary. I admittedly let it play a little bit longer, silly food, because I was reliving, dancing in the street with our people. So we're going to keep moving along through the rest of our program. And now I would like to call up Helen Rima, who they will be introducing Dr. Helen Yaffe. And Dr. Helen Yaffe also dropped in the chat that the full documentary is available on YouTube. Please check that documentary out, as well as other documentaries also produced by Helen, in addition to her written works as well. So now bringing up Helen Rima to introduce Dr. Yaffe.
Yeah, Helen number 2 here. I get the distinct pleasure of taking my time to give this introduction. So Dr. Helen Yaffe is a senior lecturer in economic and social history at the University of Glasgow and a visiting fellow at the Latin American Caribbean Center at her alma mater, London School of Economics, where she also earned her master's and PhD in economics and economic history. She has taught courses on the history of economics, development studies, and political economy. Her current teachings focus on Cuban and Latin American development. Since 1995, she has spent time living and researching in Cuba and participating in solidarity campaigns. Her doctoral research examined the least known aspects of the 20th century's best known icon, the economic work of Ernesto Che Guevara as a member of the Cuban government and his contributions to the socialist political economy debates. Her books on Cuba have become set texts in Cuba studies, and her articles have been published in broad range of media outlets of academia, including Jacobin, Le Monde Diplomatique, and the Conversation and Counterpunch. Dr. Yaffe frequently provides commentary at the mainstream media on development of Cuba and Cuba-US relations. Her most recent book, We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, was praised for its insightful analysis by Professor William Leo Grande, and for being, quote, written with clarity and flair by Ricardo Alarcón, former president of the Cuban National Assembly. Her first book, Che Guevara, The Economic Revolution, was described as a, quote, brilliant book by Richard Gott, The Guardian, and, quote, exciting, well-written, well-documented by Claes Burdeñas in the Journal of Latin American Studies, who added, quote, what is unique about Yaffe's book is her impressive use of new, until now unexplored Cuban sources. Dr. Yaffe is also co-author of the book Youth Activism and Solidarity, the Nonstop Picket Against Apartheid. She has co-produced 2 documentaries, Cuba and COVID-19 Public Health, Science and Solidarity, and Cuba's Live Task, Combating Climate Change, which premiered in Glasgow in November during COP26, the International Climate Change Conference in that city. The screening was addressed by Cuba's Minister of Science, Technology, and the Environment, Elba Rosa Montoya, who attended with the rest of the Cuban delegation to COP26. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Helen Yaffe.
Virtual claps, virtual claps.
Thank you so much. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for the invitation. I really wish I was there and we could have had this event in person. That was a really long, embarrassing introduction. And the presentation was fab. I mean, I teach Cuban history, right? And it is so hard to, cover that material concisely, but make the relevant political points. And I think you did really well, both parts of that presentation, and linking it, to US, and sort of brought perspectives to my mind that I hadn't thought of. So yeah, brilliant. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, we are very excited to have you here. Really appreciate you giving us your time tonight. And what I'm going to do is all of the members of all of the host members of this event have questions for you. People have questions, Dr. Yaffe. So I'm going to start with a question from the People's Budget Coalition. So what the People's Budget Coalition says is that, like, the documentary really sort of highlighted how understanding complex concepts requires a massive change in mentality. We can accomplish this through open access to information, equal distribution of knowledge, and most importantly, converting knowledge into accessible language for public consumption. This creates a channel of communication between different knowledge bases, the larger goal being for our especially vulnerable communities to become and remain actively engaged in decision-making processes, processes. Those in positions of influence and with access to resources must remain vigilant about keeping our communities highly informed so they can remain actively engaged in the decision-making process at every level. And so there's two questions here that I feel like kind of are one, so I'll combine them for you. What tools or knowledge can we utilize to ensure our especially vulnerable communities are actively engaged at every level of decision making, and also in crafting policies that mandate a right to a livable climate for all? Why is community input in this specific decision making process important?
Okay, great questions, but can I just, the difficult thing for me responding is, are these questions really talking about what happens in Cuba, where they had a revolution and you have a socialist state, we can debate the issues. Even in the documentary, they raise the issue of, how do we increase engagement and participation? Or are these questions saying, in our capitalist imperialist countries, our consumer societies, where, we're told that this is democracy? Because I think the answer is extremely different for both of those scenarios. In terms of, if we're talking about, because it says, our vulnerable community. So if you're talking about the US, and you could be talking about Britain, I think, that saying is really correct. Knowledge is power, arm yourself. So, we need to get the information out there, and events like this are really useful. We made a documentary. I'd already written a chapter about Cuba's state response to climate change, right? But it's in an academic book that costs hundreds of pounds, and who's going to read it? So actually, making a documentary is going to reach a broader audience. Lots of people learn in a visual audio way. So, it's thinking about how do we communicate with people. But the other thing is, I think that one of the most insidious things about capitalism and our developed capitalist consumer societies is they make you feel that you can't change anything, right? We have this system called democracy, and your job is just to go out every 5 years and tick a box or not bother, and it probably won't affect the outcome, and it really is very unlikely to affect your daily life and the struggles that you face in your communities. So, this is one of the things, when we are just passing on, educating and bringing knowledge, we also have to somehow bring with that the notion that we can affect change, and that we can do that by working collectively. And I think that is the really important lesson. Otherwise, what do? You sit with your head in your hands, lamenting at the terrible state of
impending climate change catastrophe. So that is, you know, in a way where Cuba comes in, because you know, Cuba shows us that it is possible to break the chains of oppression. I mean, the Cubans have broken they had to break out from the chains of the unequal terms of trade and, you know, centuries of colonialism and imperialism. And I thought that was really good in the presentation to compare that sort of colonial era and, you know, the production based on the slave system between your area and Cuba, because one of the things that happens to Cuba is it gets somehow dismissed, not dismissed or highlighted as something different and exceptional, and it doesn't really apply. And actually what I try to do a lot in my work is say, well, actually most of the world is in the global south. Most of the world are in countries that experience colonialism and are oppressed by imperialism and you know, are disadvantaged by the unequal terms of trade and the control of a few handful of countries, of the international financial system, and so on. So actually, Cuba is relevant, and, you know, as you're saying, it's relevant to the Lowcountry. So I feel like I'm kind of not focusing particularly on that question, but they are tricky questions. In crafting policies that mandate a right to a livable climate for all, why is community input in the decision-making process important? Well, this is something that from the perspective of Cuba, I learned a lot about by doing the research for the documentary, and I'm hoping to go back and do more research where I participate. I would like to participate in these community consultations that take place. So I mean, it's very hard to pick up when people are talking very quickly in the documentary, but if you imagine you have this ministry, the Ministry of Science, Technology and the Environment, and they sort of cascade down to the local level. So every local area, every sort of neighborhood has an office of this ministry, which is known in Cuba for the acronym as SITMA. So, you know, and every community, every neighborhood has a group of people who are meteorologists, and they're monitoring the approach of, you know, extreme weather events like hurricanes. And every community in every neighborhood has a civil defense hub. So, you know, and they're all talking to each other. So, you know, you're projecting the sort of climate change longer term processes, because as Alanda Rey says, we have to stop thinking that climate change is just an event like a hurricane. In the case of Cuba, that's what it most often is, and the sea rises that come with the upswelling, and we have to realize that actually with the rising temperatures, it's going to affect the kind of food that we can grow, the way that we dress, the buildings we have. You know, that was one of the most shocking things when I read something by Cuban scientists saying we won't be able to have pork in Cuba, which, you know, if you've been to Cuba, you know, they're sort of addicted to, and rice. I mean, you know, what is Cuba without rice? But I mean, a lot of rice is imported, but they are trying to produce their own. So it will affect everything. The rising sea levels also enters the freshwater reserves, and then you already have a problem on a small island in the Caribbean. When it doesn't rain, the reserves go down. How do you then use the water for agriculture? So it is terribly difficult. Communities matter because they know those local environments. So when the Cubans say we are looking for natural solutions, they are counting on the ingenuity, the creativity, and the sort of the commitment, engagement of those local communities to say, look, we know how we can solve this problem. We know how we can mitigate this problem. We know how we can, you know, there's this area, if we sow mangroves here, then the sea won't enter so far in. And it's really important because also at the beginning of the section that you used of the documentary, they were talking about how the Cuban state, with all of its, economic challenges, blockaded, the massive loss of revenue due to tourism, with the shutting down of the borders during COVID from tourism. And yet they are doing something that I'm not aware that any other state in the world does, is guarantee to pay the cost of relocation for communities and individuals whose houses are wrecked by the impacts of climate change. Yeah. So, you know, what they're finding is this process, they've already moved. They say like 1 million people are likely to have to move. 1 million people, think about that. And a population of 11 million, that's like 9%. And they've already moved, you know, something like 10% of that have already been relocated. But what they're realizing, and they say this themselves, it's a learning process. We're learning from those communities. They don't want to leave. And it's often problematic because they leave and then people come back and then they live without proper conditions because we've moved their conditions. We are learning that they often have solutions. So I think these things are really important for engagement, for empowerment, whether we're talking about our capitalist societies or the process that you see underway in Cuba. In Cuba, of course, they have the power of the institutions of the state to represent them. And that is the big difference, which we don't have.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that was the most depressing thing for me coming back. You go, you have all these experiences, you learn all these things, and you're like, oh yeah, I can totally like just start trying to do that back in the US. And then you realize like, no, the major difference here is that those people actually have the support of the state, whereas our state is like actively trying to exterminate us and doesn't actually care to hear our voices. Another thing I hear you saying is that perhaps our current models of electoral participation and representation aren't sufficient. Maybe this idea of like electing a person here or there to represent the interest of lots of people in lots of different areas is perhaps a model that should be further investigated and maybe tinkered with. To
say the least. I mean, to say the least, like what do you do when you go to the ballot box in our so-called multi-party democracies? You hand your sovereignty over to a politician. You usually, certainly in my country, a rich white male, because we have very few politicians who are not rich white males, and you hand over your sovereignty, and you know they make promises, you elect them, and they can go off and do what they want. In Cuba, that's not how it works, right? People, I mean, this is a whole nother session we should definitely do about how the Cuban system of representation and democracy, dare I say, it works. It's turning everything we know on its head. And you know, one of the really important things is people are electing their neighbors and their colleagues from work. They can't self-nominate. You have to be nominated by your peers. There's no electioneering. There's no careers as a politician. So you continue to be in the occupation or employment that you're in, receiving that salary. So there's no material incentive to become a politician. That removes the element of corruption. And you have the right to recall. So your representative has to, what they call render accounts. They have to go back to their constituency at least once every 6 months and say what they've done to represent them, and you know how they're going about solving these whatever the local problems and concerns are. And if they're not doing that, and they're not deemed to be doing that, they can be recalled. So, you know, the process is much more dynamic, and there's much more empowerment of the electorate.
Yes, thank you for that breakdown. It's very helpful, I think, to hear, to put things in perspective. I'm going to go to our next question from the Lowcountry Black and Hispanic Coalition. And what the Lowcountry Black and Hispanic Coalition asks is, if you can talk about the COVID response in Cuba and what made it so different from the response we saw here in the US. Why is Cuba so committed to helping other countries, even though it faces many challenges itself?
You know, I mean, God, I don't know if it could be more different, Cuba's response from, I mean, I wasn't in the United States, but I can, you know, I was assessing from afar, but from Britain, which doesn't have a privatized system. We still have a national healthcare system, but, you know, Cuba has a single, so it's not, if you're rich, you can opt out and go private, a single, universal, free public healthcare system. They have more doctors per person than anywhere in the world. They have more doctors per person than the United States, 3 times more. Yeah. So, and you know, and these are not doctors you're not paying for the privilege to see them. So they have this approach to healthcare, which is a community-based and focused on prevention. And this is really, really important. What it means is that in every neighborhood, once again, you have a family doctor's clinic, and you either have the doctor and their family living there or the nurse and their family. And what that means is there's 24 hours a day, there's someone available. But they also know the ratio of medical personnel is so high, they know their neighbors. So they already have people categorized according to their health status, right? So a disease like COVID comes along and it's a respiratory problem. They know their patients who have a respiratory issue. So they can immediately start giving them preferential and specialized care. But, you know, I should say they are doing that anyway. In the mornings, people have appointments, they go and see the doctor and the nurse. In the afternoons, the doctor and the nurse go and visit the neighbors who are vulnerable, particularly focusing, but they visit everyone once a year. And they're looking at the sort of social, they call it biosocial environmental factors that can impact someone's health. What happened with COVID? The Cubans also have a long history of epidemiological experience, so responding to infectious diseases. And they have that from their own history, but very quickly, within the first few decades after the revolution, they eliminated poverty-related and many infectious diseases. There's a whole list of them. I'm not going to reel it off. But they continued to send tens of thousands of medics to countries, particularly in the 70s in Africa and continuing into the 80s. Later, from the 2000s, more into other regions as well, not without, but as well, like Latin America. But they were sending their medics to areas of the world which had diseases which had long since been eliminated in Cuba. So they set up a very comprehensive, well-practiced system of quarantine. So they knew, you know, when COVID comes in, they knew how to do quarantine. They immediately step into the procedure. Now, partly because of sanctions and international costs, they weren't able to take the sort of South Korean approach of immediately testing everyone all the time. They couldn't get the testing kits, right? And it took time for them to be able to produce their own, and they have to get the inputs. The blockade affects, when we say the blockade affects every sector, it really is relentless. So their approach was instead to mobilize that community-based public health response. The universities closed, as they did in most countries, and 28,000 medical students went to work alongside those family doctors and nurses. And they went door to door, knock, 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 100 doors in, working in twos, 100 doors each day. How's everyone feeling? Does anyone have a cough? Does anyone have a shortness of breath? Anyone suspected of having COVID was taken out of community circulation and tested and put in quarantine. So that was their approach, which helps us to understand why by the end of 2020, Cuba had only had 146 deaths in the whole year. I mean, I don't know what it was exactly at that point in the United States, but, you know, it was
very grave.
And if you look at also, it's not fair to compare the US and Cuba in terms of their population size, but you can look at fatality rates. In Cuba, the fatality rate from COVID has been something around 0.6 or 0.8. Whereas in Britain, at the same time, it was like 2.5 or 2. Sometimes higher, sometimes lower. So not only have they managed to limit contagion, they've also managed to keep more people alive. And part of that is this really, everyone in the beginning, everyone with symptoms or with COVID was hospitalized. So not left at home. I mean, terrible stories we were hearing about people who are left at home, died in the night and so on. In Britain and in the United States, the situation was appalling, and I believe it still is, but people aren't particularly talking about it. So that's what they did. At the same time, they used their quite incredible biotechnology industry or sector, which is something I've written about. There's a whole chapter on it in my book. And they started to take some of their existing biotech products and use them as treatments for those patients. But they also started very early on to develop their own COVID-19 vaccines. And they had problems with that, again, because of the United States blockade, when they knew that they were, they had come up with something that was working, the Soberana vaccine. They couldn't get certain inputs that they needed because of sanctions. And that delayed the rollout of the vaccines. And in 2021, you had, culminating in summer, the first surge that Cuba had, which put a strain on the hospitals in the regions that were under surge. And, it was alarming for Cubans. They have, unlike most of us around the world, they've never seen their public healthcare system under that sort of strain. And that sort of contributed to the first set of protests that we've seen nationwide since the revolution of 1959. But there was all other factors to do with the sanctions, the Trump measures, a lot of the social media war on Cuba, which we can talk about again, probably another time. But Cuba's response to COVID-19 has been absolutely to prioritize public health and welfare. And, the economy has suffered massively because they closed their borders. They're very dependent on tourism, not necessarily by choice, actually, because Salufu was talking about when they recovered from the special period and their options of what they can do in international trade are limited because of the US blockade, and tourism was one option. And there was a lot of reluctance because tourism, wasn't what they wanted to build their economy around, but they did. They, lost 70% of their revenue in 2020 when the borders closed. And it has been extremely difficult for Cuba. But they still, even during the surge, they have still had a mortality rate from COVID that remained below 1%. So really quite exceptional. And they have now 5, we have to call them candidate vaccines, apparently, but they have 5 candidate vaccines for COVID-19. The only country in the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean to have developed their own vaccines, and all of them that they have approved so far. So that's the Soberana vaccines, 3 Soberana vaccines. One of them is for convalescent patients, so people have already had COVID. It's to boost their immune system, but they've realized that works really well with the other Soberanas. And they also have Soberana vaccines for children from 2 up. So Cuba has become the first country in the world to vaccinate all of its infants from 2 years up. And they all have efficacy results of over 90%. So, quite remarkable.
Thank you. Guys, we have one more question from the general sort of coalition of people here today. But if you in the audience have questions, please drop those in the chat and I will prioritize them over my own questions, which is, an act of love, an act of sharing. So please start dropping your questions in the chat if you have those. While I move into asking this question from the Charleston Climate Coalition. So Cuba's recently approved constitution establishes the human right of a healthy, balanced environment. What do you think Charleston and the US can learn from this rights-based approach to a livable climate? How is this approach reflected in the solutions Cuba pursues?
So again, this is another question that it's as you were saying, we realize we can't copy from Cuba, but we can certainly emulate some of the strategies, because it's all about empowerment and showing people that there is an alternative way to build society. So, I mean, the reason that Cuba can do the things it can do, the achievements that it's made, the ones that I focus on in my book, We Are Cuba, the COVID vaccines, the public healthcare system, the results in biotechnology, and now this state plan to confront climate change, is precisely because it is a socialist state, which means that decisions about production, distribution, and consumption aren't determined by private profit-making interests. And, that makes all the difference. So in terms of, what can Charleston and the US learn from Cuba's rights-based approach? I mean, you just have to battle against those private profit-seeking interests. There is no other way. I mean, they aren't concerned about, our children having asthma rates that are killing them because of pollution, and they're not concerned about rising sea levels or whether your house falls into the sea. That's your problem. In Cuba they are, because the whole notion of a socialist state is it represents the people, and that's all you can say. Is you can just look to Cuba as I wouldn't say a model, because I think the Cuban system is a product of Cuban history, but certainly as an example that it is possible to build an alternative. Now, if you think about the kind of wealth that exists in the United States, if there was some control over production, distribution, and consumption that was not based on private profit-seeking interests, but on human welfare, I mean, the whole scenario would change. The standard of living for most people in the US would actually rise. And I think this is a big ideological battle. It's a big battle of ideas, right, as they call it in Cuba. We've been told, but you've been told in the US probably even more. I mean, it's been so demonized, ideas of socialism and communism and what that means. And actually, the people who stand to gain most from that misconception are the people that are the elites, who are the ones who are profiting from the disastrous situation we are heading towards. I mean, honestly, if any of you really want to depress yourselves, go and read the latest IPCC report, the climate change report, and they are saying we are driving at full speed towards a brick wall. We are basically driving our species into extinction. So I know what it's like. It's hard. People are working and caring for their kids and their families and their loved ones, and they've got their heads down and they're just getting on with it. But there's only so long we'll be able to do that before we all face that existential threat. And we're earlier in the documentary, we have this amazing short speech. It was the shortest I think he'd ever given, by Fidel Castro at the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit of 1992, and appropriately alarming. And he starts out by saying, a species is facing extinction, and it's mankind. And he really explains how that is linked to the history of the development of colonialism and imperialism and capitalist consumer societies. So it's worth checking that out. It's quite an extraordinary to think how long ago he said it, and he ended with the words, back in 1992, tomorrow will be too late to do what we should have done a long time ago. So we're well too late already.
Absolutely. I also want to read this message that Jewel dropped in the chat. It says, I just want to remind people that Cuba has not always been the way it is now. They had the same problems we had back in the 50s and 60s, and it has not been easy for them. The Revolutionary Vanguard have really organized their people day to day, going house to house. They also had a literacy campaign, which we desperately need to have in this country, where so many people are functionally illiterate. Absolutely. Our main problem is the lack of leadership here in organization. I definitely want to emphasize that that point on organization as I get ready to throw the next question to Dr. Yaffe, that a part of the reason why this coalition has come together to put on this event is because we all believe in the importance of organization, and we've seen. Many of us have seen with our own eyes how organization functions in Cuba. Like, in the US, they task force us to death. There's a task force for everything. But in Cuba, there's really an organization to tackle every issue. And those organizations are empowered, yes, but the function of organizations is to get to the root of problems and to work with people day in and day out to solve those problems. So anybody here that is not a part of an organization and you're in the Charleston area, there's a few of us on Zoom. We're going to all share our information at the end of this. so that you can reach out and see how you can get involved. So the last thing I want to ask you about is your most recent book. Could you just tell us a little bit about it, where we can pick it up, why we should read it?
Okay, so when I started studying Cuba and I was reading English language textbooks in university, and it was always like, you know, Cuba only exists because of the Soviet Union, Cuba's a satellite state and all this. And so by the time I started, you know, working on my book, I was like, well, hold on a minute, Cuba has now been, the Cuban Revolution has been around for longer since the Soviet Union collapsed than it was before. So clearly there is something going on there, right? And, you know, this is not you. I mean, if you believe some of the crap that's churned out in the United States, then you wouldn't know this. But if you've been to Cuba yourself, you will know that the revolutionary state doesn't rely on repression to keep going. It has incredible popular support. Yes, there are people who are fed up, and yes, there are people who, you know, want to see the restoration of capitalism, or they just want to make a bit more money, or all the rest of it. But the population has not rejected the revolutionary state. That's clear. So what's going on there, right? And how is it that occasionally something happens like Ebola in West Africa, and suddenly the mainstream media goes, oh, hold on a minute, the biggest delegation is Cuba. How has that happened, right? So, you know, those of us who've studied Cuban medical internationalism, looked at their biotech sector, we know how these things have happened. So my idea was to write a book that talked about some of those incredible developments that have taken place in Cuba, as it were, under the radar. That was a term that was used by the director of a cancer research institute in Buffalo, in the United States, who they are now trialing Cuba's lung cancer immunotherapy, lung cancer vaccine, basically. It's the first in the world. The Cubans are the first in the world to use immunotherapy for cancer, like they were the first in the world to develop a meningitis B vaccine in 1988, when my government was still telling us there's no vaccine for meningitis B, and people, you know, university students particularly, were still dying from it for 30 years after the Cubans, right? They were the first in the world to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission, the first in the world with a vaccine with a human synthetic antigen. So, I mean, just incredible things. So the point about my book was to tell that story, to look at how Cuba's been able to do it, and also to move away from this version of Cuban history, which is it's Castro, and then it became it's the Castro brothers, you know, and really interrogate all those things. Because what I conclude, and I hope if you read the book that, you know, you'll make your own judgment, but it seems clear that what Cuba is about and how it survived is about ordinary people like us being given the chance to do extraordinary things. And that's how you come up with the kind of results that Cuba has. You know, in 2006, Cuba was identified by the World Wildlife Fund as the only country in the world to have achieved sustainable development. That means they measure it scientifically, right? Living within the carrying capacity of your ecosystem whilst raising the standard of living of your population. So, you know, and there was many scientific reports have concluded that Cuba is either leading or among the leading countries in the world. And in last year, 2020, we had a new index, the Sustainable Development Index, which again put Cuba leading the world in terms of sustainable development. So, you know, we have so much to learn from Cuba, and we need to sort of cut through the crap, if you excuse my language. But, you know, we have to actually study Cuba as a real country with real people. It's not a dogma. It's not, you know, a one-man state. So what's going on? And that's what I was trying to look at with my book.
Thank you so much for coming, for this conversation, for your insights, for your energy. This has been an incredible conversation. From the entire coalition, we want to thank you so much for being here, Dr. Yaffe.
It's been a real pleasure. And, you know, I hope that you guys just carry on and do more stuff like this online, but also get together in person, because really that's what community mobilization has to be about. And just keep going, man. Just keep going.
Absolutely. So now we're going to move into the final portion of our event for tonight, which is going to be our organization announcements.
Yep. So first up is the Lowcountry Action Committee. Everyone on the line, we're looking for business owners, artists, artisans, creatives to contribute items to our raffle giveaway to raise money for our Freedom Bag Drive. We will be expanding our Freedom Bag Drive in collaboration with the Lowcountry Black and Hispanic Coalition. So we're also looking for volunteers. And then let's see what else we got here. Also want to put everybody on everybody's radar that to be looking out for more information about the Hola Charleston campaign. And does Charleston Climate Coalition or PBC have any updates?
Okay. Yeah, on April 23rd, day after Earth Day, we're going to be hosting a bike ride eco tour around downtown Charleston, tour to Earth Day 2022. So save the date for that. And if anyone on the line wants to get involved with CCC, just head to our website and sign up and get the emails. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah, so for the People's Budget Coalition, our next monthly meeting, on the first Thursday of every month at 2 p.m. virtually. If you're interested, I dropped my information in the chat. Please reach out. We'd love to have you.
Wonderful. And we would also like to encourage you all to consider going to Cuba. So the application for the Mayday Brigade is now live. Joshua, you want to say anything about the brigade real quick?
Yeah, the brigade is awesome. If you, I always encourage people, when you go to Cuba, I would encourage you to go with the brigade the first time, because that's how you're really going to get to experience Cuba. Most people go to Cuba, they may go to Havana, they may go to Santiago, but when you go to a brigade, you get to experience all the cities in between, all the programs that the brigade has organized for you. You get to go to universities, hospitals, museums, cultural centers, neighborhoods. So you really get a thorough understanding of Cuban society. So yeah, please apply to the Mayday Brigade. It's from April 23rd until May 8th. And if you, who should we direct them to if they want to reach out? I would say NNOC, National Network on Cuba. Yeah, so.
Yes, several of us have been on brigades. Joshua has been on the Mayday Brigade a few times. If you're not able to make this one, there are several other brigades that will be happening throughout the year. So you can contact us from the Lowcountry Action Committee, or you can visit the National Network on Cuba, nnoc.org for more information. And then if you want to get involved with the Charleston Climate Coalition, the Lowcountry Action Committee, the Lowcountry Black and Hispanic Coalition, the People's Budget Coalition, I would suggest getting involved with all of them because we do have a lot of cross collaboration and do collaborative events like this. The contact information is on the screen, and we'll also send out the recording to everyone that was not able to make it, but also to you all if you want to play it back and listen to Dr. Yaffe's great answers once again. I'll leave this up for a few seconds, but that is the entirety of our program, and we're almost ending on time. I'm so proud of us. So thank you all for joining. We'll stay on the line for a few minutes to answer any follow-up questions that you might have, but thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Todd, for giving us your email address, and we'll definitely reach out. Yes, it's possible to get involved even though you're based in France, and thank you for joining. We will definitely follow up with you. We are connecting the dots across the diaspora. This is an international work, even though we're talking on a local level, we're talking about Cuba as well. There are just so many connections that we have and that we need to look at and be educated and organized so that we can fight together for our collective future to make sure that we still have a future. So thank you all again so much for joining us.